January 17th, 1945, a clearing near Bastogne, Belgium. The air itself feels brittle, frozen. It tastes of pine, cordite, and diesel exhaust. Under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, the pines of the Ardennes stand like silent, skeletal sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The ground is a churned morass of mud and ice, scarred by tank treads and shell craters. This is the ragged edge of the Allied counteroffensive, the bloody aftermath of the Bulge. For Captain Daniel Mallory, surgeon, U.S. Army Medical Corps, this clearing is the entire world. His hospital is a sprawling canvas tent, its flaps snapping violently in a wind that carries the distant, percussive cough of 105mm howitzers. Inside, the air is thick with the smells of boiled wool, antiseptic, blood, and the metallic tang of fear. Coleman lanterns hiss, casting long, dancing shadows that make the rows of wounded men on their cots look like figures in a fever dream. Mallory moves through it all with a practiced economy of motion, his face a mask of exhaustion. His hands, though chapped and raw from the cold, are steady. They have to be. For 2 weeks, they have been the only thing standing between hundreds of young men and the frozen earth. He's stitching a deep gash on a private's forearm, the needle dipping in and out of flesh with grim precision, when the tent flap is thrown open with a burst of frigid air and frantic motion. 2 men from the 101st Airborne, their faces smeared with grime and stubble, half carry, half drag a stretcher. On it lies a figure bundled in a filthy Wehrmacht greatcoat and stained blankets. It's impossible to tell if it's a man or a woman, alive or dead. Sergeant Frank Rizzo, a thick-necked NCO with weary eyes, grunts as they set the stretcher down near Mallory's station. "Doc, got one for ya, a kraut." Mallory doesn't look up from his stitch. "Alive?" "For now," the other soldier, a young private, says, rubbing his hands together. "Found her in a collapsed bunker a click east of here. Last one left. Don't know how she was still breathing." Her. Mallory ties off the suture and snips the thread. He finally turns his attention to the stretcher. He pulls back a corner of the rough wool blanket. The face is pale, almost translucent, framed by strands of matted blonde hair. Blue eyes, clouded with shock and pain, stare up at the canvas ceiling, unfocused. Her lips are cracked and blue. She is young, frighteningly young. "She armed?" he asks, his voice flat. Rizzo snorts. "Doc, she can't move. We checked. Just a POW who needs patching up before we send her down the line." He sounds impatient, eager to be rid of his burden, to get back to the warmth of a fire or the oblivion of sleep. To Mallory, the patient on the stretcher is not a kraut or a POW. She is a collection of symptoms, a puzzle of trauma to be solved. He places his fingers on her neck, searching for a pulse. It's there, but it's a faint, thready flutter, like a trapped moth. Thready and fast. Shock. He begins his initial assessment, his hands moving over the bundled form. He checks for obvious bleeding, for the telltale rigidity of a belly wound, for the mushy feel of a head injury. Everything is obscured by the thick layers of wool and the rigid way she holds herself. But something is wrong. Something is profoundly unnatural about her posture, even beneath the blankets. Her legs are splayed at a strange, fixed angle. Not bent, not broken in a conventional way, but open, as if held apart by an invisible force. He frowns, a knot of clinical curiosity tightening in his gut. He's seen every kind of battlefield injury imaginable, mangled limbs, perforated chests, shredded faces. But this is different. This quiet, geometric wrongness is unsettling. The woman moans, a low, guttural sound of pure misery. Her eyes find his for a fleeting second, and a single, desperate German phrase escapes her lips, a whisper lost in the cacophony of the tent. "Warum?" Why? "Get her over there," Mallory says, pointing with his chin toward a screened-off corner of the tent that offers the barest illusion of privacy, "and get these wet things off her." Sergeant Rizzo and the private heave the stretcher again, their boots squelching in the mud that has turned the tent floor into a cold slurry. Mallory follows, grabbing a fresh syringe of morphine and a pair of trauma shears. The corner is barely warmer, the light from the single lantern even more fickle. A corpseman, a teenager named Peterson with perpetually wide eyes, stands ready with a basin of lukewarm water and gauze. As the two GIs begin to unwrap the stiff, frozen greatcoat, the smell hits them. It is the foul, cloyingly sweet odor of old blood and necrotic tissue, a smell Mallory knows better than his own name. Rizzo recoils slightly, his professional indifference momentarily cracking. The woman shivers violently as the cold air touches her. Underneath the coat, she wears the standard field gray uniform of a helperin, a female auxiliary. It is torn, soaked through, and caked with a mixture of dirt, ice, and dried blood. She is delirious, muttering now, her German words slurring together into a meaningless, painful litany. Mallory kneels beside her. "It's all right," he says, his voice low and calm, knowing she likely doesn't understand the words but might comprehend the tone. "We're going to help you." He administers the morphine, pressing the needle into her upper arm. Her muscles barely flinch. Her eyes roll back slightly as the drug begins its slow, merciful creep through her system. "Okay, let's see what we're dealing with," Mallory says, more to himself than to the others. He takes the shears and begins to cut away the sodden wool trousers. The fabric is stiff, almost frozen to her skin in places. With each snip of the shears, more of the injury is revealed, but not in the way he expects. There is no single catastrophic wound, no gaping hole from a piece of shrapnel. Instead, he sees a constellation of deep, horrific bruising. A vast, dark purple and black canvas that spreads from her lower abdomen down across her hips and thighs. The two soldiers, Rizzo and the private, fall silent. They have seen death and dismemberment, but the sheer, silent violence painted on this woman's skin is unnerving. It looks as if she was beaten with a club, but even that doesn't seem right. The pattern is too symmetrical, too profound. And still, there is the question of her legs. They remain fixed in that strange open position, an angle that defies anatomy. Mallory gently places a hand on her knee, intending to test for a femoral fracture. He tries to guide her leg inward, toward a more natural resting state. A strangled scream, high-pitched and full of agony, tears from her throat, cutting through the din of the tent. Her whole body arches in a spasm of unbearable pain. Mallory pulls his hand back as if burned. "Christ, Doc," Rizzo mutters, taking a step back. Mallory ignores him, his focus narrowing entirely onto the patient. The scream has subsided into ragged, shallow breaths. And then, in a moment of shocking lucidity, her eyes clear. They lock onto his, and she asks the question again, this time in clear, halting German, her voice a raw whisper. "Warum kann ich meine Beine nicht schließen? Why? Why can't I close my legs?" The question hangs in the cold air, a simple, terrifying query that has no immediate answer. It is not the question of a soldier wondering about a wound. It is the plea of a person who has lost control of her own body in the most fundamental way. For Mallory, it transforms from a medical mystery into a horrifying enigma. He looks at her splayed limbs, at the geography of her bruises, and a cold dread begins to seep into his bones. This is not a bullet wound. This is not a blast injury. This is something else entirely. Captain Mallory waves a hand, dismissing the two soldiers. "Go on, get some coffee. Peterson, stay with me." Rizzo and the private don't need to be told twice. They retreat from the small enclosure, leaving Mallory alone with the corpsman and the woman on the stretcher. The morphine has taken the edge off her agony, pulling her back into a semi-conscious haze, but her question still echoes in the space. Why can't I close my legs? It is a question of mechanics, of anatomy, but Mallory senses it is also a question of sanity. He must understand the mechanism of the injury. He pulls on a pair of rubber gloves and instructs Peterson to hold the lantern closer. The flickering light plays across the bruised landscape of her skin. The discoloration is deepest around her hips, a dark, angry corona centered on the pelvic bones. He begins a more thorough examination, his touch now incredibly gentle, his fingers probing with the sensitivity of a safecracker. He runs his hand along her thigh, feeling the solid, uninterrupted line of the femur. No break there. He checks the tibias and fibulas, all intact. The bones of her legs are fine. The problem is higher up. The problem is the foundation. Easy now, he murmurs as he moves his hands to her hips. You are trained to feel the clean, sharp edge of a fracture, the grating protest of bone against bone known as crepitus. But this is different. As he carefully palpates the iliac crest, the wide, flaring bone at the top of the hip, he feels a sickening instability. The bone shifts under his fingers in a way it never should. It feels loose, unmoored from the rest of her skeleton. He moves to the front, to the pubic symphysis, the joint of cartilage that connects the two halves of the pelvis. Here, his blood runs cold. Instead of a firm, almost immovable joint, his fingers sink into a wide, soft gap, a chasm where there should be solid structure. Peterson sees the look on his face. Captain, what is it? Mallory doesn't answer immediately. He is processing the impossible. He moves to her other side, his hands mapping out the same horrifying looseness. It's as if the entire front of her pelvis has been split open like a book, an open book pelvic fracture. It's a term he'd read in textbooks, a catastrophic injury usually seen in high-speed car crashes or falls from great heights. It is an injury of overwhelming, instantaneous force. To see it on the battlefield is almost unheard of. It takes a specific, monstrous kind of trauma to literally tear a human pelvis in half. A bullet can't do it. Shrapnel can't do it. A bayonet can't do it. This was something else. This was a crushing force. He now understands the geometry of her suffering. Her legs are splayed because there is nothing holding them together. The ring of bone that connects the spine to the lower limbs has been violently broken and forced open. Every attempt to move her legs inward puts excruciating pressure on the torn ligaments and shattered bone ends. Every breath she takes causes the broken halves of her pelvis to shift, grinding against soft tissue, sending waves of blinding pain through her body. He realizes with a sickening lurch that the bruising isn't from a beating. It is the visible evidence of massive internal hemorrhaging, of blood pouring into the shattered cavity of her pelvis from severed arteries. She is bleeding to death internally and has been for hours, perhaps days. He looks at her face, now slack with narcotics and exhaustion. He imagines the moment it happened, the unimaginable weight, the sound of her own bones giving way. He looks at the grime under her fingernails, the scrapes on her face. She was trapped. She hadn't been standing in the open when a shell landed nearby. She had been caught, pinned, and squeezed by an immense, impartial weight. The bunker the soldiers mentioned. It wasn't just where they found her. It was the weapon that had destroyed her. The very concrete and steel meant to protect her had become the instrument of her torture, slowly, inexorably breaking her apart from the inside out. He finally has the answer to her question. But it's an answer so horrific, he doesn't know how any human being could survive hearing it.
More light, Peterson. And get me 4 units of plasma, now. Mallory's voice is sharp, cutting through his own shock. The time for diagnosis is over. Now begins the desperate, perhaps futile battle to save her. As the young corpsman scrambles to obey, Mallory tries to piece together the narrative of her agony, using the clues written on her broken body. He sees the abrasions on her arms and shoulders, the pattern of dust and concrete particles embedded in her uniform. She was likely on her back when it happened. Through the fog of morphine, she begins to murmur again, not the incoherent moans from before, but fragmented words, ghosts of memory rising to the surface. Dunkel, so dunkel. Dark, so dark. Stimme, keine Stimme. Voices, no voices. Mallory, whose own grandparents were German immigrants, understands enough. He leans closer, trying to catch the whispers. She speaks of a sudden roar, a noise that swallowed the world. She speaks of the sky falling, not a metaphor, the literal, concrete sky of the bunker ceiling. She was a nurse, she says, a Krankenschwester. She was tending to a wounded soldier when the American artillery found their position. A direct hit from a 155mm shell. The world became noise, pressure, and then nothing. He can picture it. The blast wave pulverizing the reinforced concrete. A massive slab, a multi-ton piece of the ceiling, not collapsing entirely, but cracking, shifting, and dropping just enough to pin her. It must have landed directly across her hips. its immense weight doing what no weapon designed for killing a single person could. It didn't just break her, it fundamentally altered her structure. He visualizes her trapped in the darkness, the weight on her pelvis becoming a constant, screaming reality. The dust slowly settling, the silence that followed the explosion, a silence deeper and more terrifying than the noise itself. Kalt, she whispers, cold. The cold of the concrete seeping into her, the life-giving warmth of her own blood pooling internally, lost to her. She must have been there for days. Listening to the groans of the other wounded fade one by one into silence, calling out until her throat was raw, until she realized no one was left to hear her. Trapped in a tomb with the dead, fully conscious, her body slowly breaking under a weight she could not move. You try to imagine the psychological toll, the terror giving way to a strange, agonizing resignation, the feeling of your own body coming apart, the sensation of bones where they should not be, the loss of control that led to her one haunting question. Why can't I close my legs? Was not just a medical query. It was the ultimate expression of her helplessness. She was a prisoner in her own shattered form long before the American soldiers found her. The GIs from the 101st had simply been clearing ruins. They would have seen a pile of rubble and then a flicker of movement, a hand. They dug her out, thinking they were saving a life. They had no way of knowing they were lifting her off the very instrument that was killing her, releasing the pressure that may have been staunching the worst of the internal bleeding. They put her on a stretcher, and with every jolt and bump of the journey to this tent, the broken edges of her pelvis were grinding, severing more blood vessels, pushing her closer to the brink. Mallory looks down at his own hands. The irony is staggering. The shell that did this to her could have been fired by an American battery just over the ridge. In the impersonal calculus of war, his own army had brutalized her, and now he is her only hope. The plasma arrives and he gets to work, but he knows it's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. He has to fix the bucket itself. The challenge is immense, almost insurmountable in a canvas tent in the middle of a frozen forest. A severe pelvic fracture requires an operating theater, advanced imaging, and an orthopedic surgical team. Mallory has a folding table, a few basic instruments, and a dwindling supply of plasma. He cannot perform surgery here. He cannot truly fix the damage. All he can do is try to build a fragile bridge, a temporary structure to hold her together long enough to survive the brutal, jolting ambulance ride to a real hospital miles behind the lines, if she can even survive being moved to the ambulance. "Peterson," he barks, his mind racing, "get me every blanket we can spare, and rifle slings, at least 4 of them, leather ones, now." The courseman, seeing the fierce intensity in the captain's eyes, runs to do his bidding. Mallory's plan is born of desperation and battlefield improvisation. He needs to close the book. He needs to force the 2 halves of her pelvis back together, or at least closer, to create a tamponade effect, using the pressure of the realigned bones to compress the severed blood vessels and slow the bleeding. It will be an act of controlled, excruciating violence. He explains it to her in his simple, halting German. "Ich muss drücken," he says, making a pressing motion with his hands. "I must push. Es wird weh tun. It will hurt." He doesn't know if she understands, but he sees a flicker of something in her eyes. Not consent, perhaps, but a profound weariness that looks like acceptance. She is past fighting. When Peterson returns with the supplies, Mallory directs him. They roll the cleanest blankets into tight, firm cylinders. This is not about comfort, it is about pressure. He has Peterson and another courseman take hold of her legs. "When I say now," Mallory instructs, "I need you to push her knees together, gently but firmly. Don't stop, no matter what she does. Understand?" The young men nod, their faces pale. Mallory positions himself over her, his hands on the flaring crests of her hip bones. He takes a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. This is the moment. He will either stabilize her or kill her. "Now," he commands. As the coursemen press her legs inward, a terrible, low groan escapes the woman's lips.
Her back arches again, her fingers clenching into fists. Mallory ignores it. He throws his own weight downward and inward, squeezing the shattered pelvic ring with all his strength. He feels a grotesque, spongy shifting of bone and tissue beneath his palms, a movement that feels like a violation of all natural law. The woman's groan turns into a sustained, breathless cry of pure, undiluted agony. For a few horrifying seconds, the tent is filled with that sound. Then, as the bones are forced into a closer approximation of their normal position, she goes limp, passing out from the pain. "Hold it," Mallory shouts. "Don't let go." While the two men hold her legs together, Mallory works frantically, wrapping a tightly folded blanket around her hips like a giant girdle. He takes the thick leather rifle slings and cinches them around the blanket, pulling them brutally tight, using the buckles to ratchet up the pressure. He creates a makeshift pelvic binder, a crude external brace designed to hold her fractured skeleton in place. It is a desperate, ugly solution, but it is the only one he has. He checks her pulse again. It is still dangerously fast, but he imagines, he prays, that it feels a fraction stronger. He has done all he can do. The rest is up to a bumpy Jeep ride and God. He straightens up, his back aching, his own uniform now stained with her blood. He looks at her pale, unconscious face, and for the first time, he reaches out and pushes a stray strand of matted hair from her forehead. A gesture that has nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with humanity. He doesn't know her name. He doesn't know if she has a family. He only knows that in the heart of the war's vast, impersonal cruelty, he has been witness to a singular, intimate horror, and he has tried to stand against it.